This episode of To Be Continued is sponsored by Gail and Dennis Roth in loving memory of Gail's parents, Francis and Meyer Weissman, who were both born in Czechoslovakia. Francis survived both Auschwitz and Bergen-Belsen, and Meyer endured various hard labor camps. They were thrilled to arrive in New York in 1949 to begin a new life together. Welcome to Be Continued, Reflections on Growing Up with Holocaust Survivors. I'm your host, Rabbi Jeff Salkin. In this podcast, we explore how the Holocaust continues to shape the lives of the children and grandchildren of survivors. Our conversations begin with stories of survival, but they go beyond those experiences to examine the profound impact the Holocaust has had on the generations that followed, their identities, their relationships, their choices, and their sense of responsibility. Jewish tradition teaches us the importance of l'dor vador, from generation to generation. Each generation receives a story, but also has the opportunity to interpret it and to give that story new meaning. Through conversations with descendants of survivors, we explore the intersections of memory, identity, and resilience, asking, how did those memories form you? How did resilience shape the person you became? And what legacy will you leave for those who come after you? My guest today is Judy Batalion, a New York Times bestselling author of award-winning nonfiction and fiction. Her work has brought powerful stories of Jewish courage and resistance to readers around the world. Her essays have appeared in the New York Times, the Washington Post, and Vogue, among other publications. She earned her bachelor's degree at Harvard and a PhD from the University of London, and she has worked as a museum curator and university lecturer. Today, Judy lives in New York City with her husband and her 3 children. As the granddaughter of Holocaust survivors, Judy grew up in Montreal with her parents, her younger brother, and a house that was overflowing with the possessions her mother struggled to part with. Her family was shaped by the experiences of her maternal grandparents, Holocaust survivors who endured displacement and hardship before rebuilding their lives. Like many children and grandchildren of survivors, Judy inherited not only their history, but also the questions that come with growing up in the shadow of that history. That journey has informed her writing. She is the author of White Walls, a memoir about motherhood, daughterhood, and the mess in between, which Warner Brothers has optioned for development as a television series called Cluttered. She also wrote the New York Times bestseller, The Light of Days, the untold story of women resistance fighters in Hitler's ghettos, for which Steven Spielberg's Amblin Partners has optioned the film rights. And now her newest novel is The Last Woman of Warsaw, a story of friendship, love, and home set in Warsaw on the eve of World War II. Judy Batalion's work spans history, memoir, and fiction, but at the heart of it all is a question that feels especially relevant to our conversation today. How does the past continue to shape us? Judy, welcome to Be Continued, and it's really a privilege to have you with us.
Well, thank you so much for inviting me to be here today, and thank you for that very gracious introduction. Thank you.
Well, it's well earned. I should tell you, by the way, that I absolutely loved your book, The Light of Days, and it's a really compelling read, and I can't wait for it to reach a wider audience because it so deserves that.
Fingers crossed. Yes, thank you so much.
Stardom being what it is, let's start this way. I'd like to begin with the story of the generation that came before you. Your family has deep roots in Poland, and your paternal grandparents' journey is an extraordinary one. It goes from Poland to Siberia, their return, the birth of your mother during that journey. Would you tell us that story?
Sure. I always feel I need to preface my own story by saying, I've spent now 19 years professionally researching and writing about the Holocaust, and yet my own personal story is still very vague. There's so many ruptures in my own family narrative, but I will share with you what I know, or at least what family lore has been. So my maternal grandparents, Bobby and Zadie, they were living in Warsaw in the late 30s when the Nazis occupied Warsaw. They were in their mid and late 20s. They were married. And the story from my grandmother is that she had 7 siblings, and of all of them, she looked the least Jewish. She was most able to pass as a Christian Pole. And so early on in the war, there were lines for food rations. Food it was hard to retrieve food, and it was my grandmother who would go out and get food for not just my grandfather, but her siblings, her parents. She was sort of the one that went outside, and she would tell that during her time waiting in those lines, she heard stories. She heard Nazis asking Poles where Jews live, what addresses are, what names, who could she list? They list names and addresses, and she heard her neighbors, as she told them, her neighbors turn on them and report names, and this is what she felt was her moment where she knew she was doomed, and they had to leave Warsaw. There was something very frightening in that for her. And several of her siblings did leave, not all of them. Her parents stayed with her 3 younger sisters. They were all eventually brutally murdered, I believe, at Treblinka. But my grandmother and her husband, my grandfather, they left. They early on in the war. And my grandfather had a brother who lived in eastern Poland. And so they decided to go east, which is ultimately the decision that saved them. They went to my grandfather's brother's town, and there was fighting at the time. And there was fighting between the Russian soldiers and the Germans. And my grandfather and his brother got caught in crossfire. I believe it was a Russian shot. And my grandfather was very, very short. And the bullet grazed his neck, and it hit his brother, who was standing behind him, in the heart. And his brother was killed immediately. And I know this story because my grandfather had a scar on his neck. And I had asked him as a child what it was from. And it was from this bullet that had killed his brother. My grandparents decided to continue fleeing east. This is where the story gets confusing to me. My grandmother would tell me bits and pieces. I was very close with her, but it never seemed to add up to the full narrative. But there was some bit about riding or hiding in a truck with fruit. There was a story about hiding in a convent where they'd been taken in. I remember hearing about swimming across a river as part of an escape. And I also remember hearing a story about a Nazi who turned a blind eye and let them pass. And they eventually made it to the Russian border and crossed into Russia. And along with many of the Jews who made that crossing, they were sent they were forced into Siberia. They were sent up to Siberia and forced to work in work camps in Siberia. I know very little about those camps. I know very little about what they went through. The only anecdote I ever recall my grandfather telling me was that they had to eat horses. They left those camps. I think, I'm not even sure when, but they went on a, journey, which only recently did I look at a map, and it didn't even, they went extremely far east. They went to Kyrgyzstan. I only recently realized how far east that was. And they stayed there for a little bit. My grandfather was I found some photo before my mother died. I asked what this was. She said it was my grandfather working as a mechanic in Kyrgyzstan. And my mother was born there in 1945 while they were stopped temporarily in Kyrgyzstan. And then they continued on the route and it came back to Poland where they lived. Jews were resettled into Western Poland. They lived in Wrocław for a few years, trying to build a life there and seeing if anyone survived, if any of their many siblings had survived the war, trying to put their lives back together. And I believe my grandfather was uncomfortable with the political life in Poland, with the communism. He was afraid, and they ended up in 49 leaving Poland and moving to Israel, where they stayed in. My mother tells story. I mean, they had nothing. They were basically refugees, and they stayed in a chicken coop. And my mother would tell a story about the chickens would peck at her toes at night. They were displaced people, and they lived in these camps for some time. And then eventually in the early 50s, they came to Canada, where my grandmother's sister, one of her sisters, had survived and was living in Montreal and helped my grandmother come over to Montreal.
What do you know about your mother's childhood growing up as the daughter of two Holocaust survivors? And how did that impact or shape the home that you grew up in?
I mean, my mother's childhood was very nomadic. They lived in Western Poland for some time. I believe my grandfather, had work there, and they survived there. But it was I always talk about my mother's childhood as she was a refugee before knowing what a home was. She was born while they were on the run in Kyrgyzstan. They came back through all the way to Poland. They lived there for a couple of years. My grandmother actually had another child who died shortly after childbirth, and that was very traumatic for the whole family and for my grandmother and for my mother. And then they moved again to Israel, and they moved to Canada. So before she was 6 years old, she had lived in, 4 continents. And I think that instability and nomadism, and being born into such a difficult and traumatic moment, certainly had its impact on her and successively on me.
What do you remember most about the way that she loved and protected and raised you?
My mother?
Yeah.
Oh, my mother. That's a very moving question. My mother really loved me. She My mother really is very absorbed. She loved art of all forms, writing, literature. She wrote poetry. She was an amazing draftsperson. She drew. She was an artist. She really had a very artistic temperament. Theater, TV, any kind of fiction, narrative story. And I really think she passionately shared that with me, and we really connected through literature, through stories, through fiction, through most of our lives. Starting when I was very young, she would read Amelia Bedelia books to me, and we would analyze the puns, and then she would teach me how to make my own puns and how to play with language, all the way through. Even as an adult, she would call me. We would have long discussions about television shows and the choices the characters were making. She was very moved by art, and we connected through that as well.
You've written rather openly about your anxiety. Looking back, where do you think it comes from? And how does it relate to what your father often said, that anxious people were the ones that left? They were survivors.
Well, if you could explain my anxiety, that would be great. I'm not sure I know exactly where my anxiety comes from. Probably comes from many places, like most things, genetic, environment, catalysts. I am a very anxious person. It's something I've struggled with my whole life. Um, yes, my father used to say that anxious people were the ones who ran and survived. And I think I that idea lives in me. I think, I inherited this notion, not consciously, but that anxiety serves a purpose. Anxiety saves you. Hyper awareness saves you. You need to be aware of what's going on, and the worst case scenario can happen. And that's sort of in my blood. And I think that causes a lot of my anxiety is this almost a burden of awareness and keeping your eyes open. Um, and not a there's no delusions that everything's going to be great. I never no one ever, that's not a an idea I grew up with. It's all going to be okay. um yeah, I don't know if that answers your
Well,
question, but
it certainly begins to. But let's go to food.
all
Uh,
right.
for for many Holocaust survivors, food became more than food. It represented
Mhm.
security. And many children and grandchildren remember that they were taught never to waste food and always to have enough. In your memoir, White Walls, you are remarkably candid about your grandmother's and your mother's compulsive hoarding.
Mm.
As you tried to understand it over the years, did you come to see those patterns as rooted in that same sense of scarcity and security, or did you come to understand them as something different altogether?
Yeah, that's a great question. Okay, so I've given hour-long lectures on this subject, so I'm trying to think about how to be succinct and interesting in a very short period. Um, many Okay, so first of all, let me say the research, there's no studies that I ever found that said many Holocaust survivors suffer from hoarding disorder or their offspring suffers from hoarding disorder in a greater prevalence than other populations. However, I would say anecdotally, when I've spoken to audiences across the country about hoarding disorder and Holocaust trauma, and I've had many, many people reach out to me to say that they lived a similar experience, that there were members of their survivor families who were also, um, uh, you know, pathological hoarders and compulsive hoarders. I did
By the
find
way,
one.
Judy, I,
Yeah,
I will say I know at least three children of survivors who are hoarders.
this any talk I gave, I would be inundated afterwards with people coming up to me to personally tell me stories. Um, However, even when I spoke outside Jewish communities, many people told me their stories too. So, but certainly within Jewish communities, I heard many, many stories from survivor families. Now, I did find one data point or research study that talked about how children who had nomadic childhoods often went on had a higher prevalence of suffering from hoarding disorder later in life. And so that's certainly something my mother had. She really, as I said, lived in 4 continents before she was 6 years old. So that is according, it's genetic, it's environmental, it's set off by some kind of traumatic catalyst. And it's a very complicated disorder that often is accompanied or comorbid with other psychological and psychiatric conditions from depression, anxiety, paranoia, suspicious behavior, social isolation, addiction. And hoarding disorder comprises, intensive attachment to objects, also for some people a need to continually acquire objects. And for others and many, it's also a disorganization with the objects. So there's all three components. And so there are many different understandings, explanations, reasons that someone might suffer from a hoarding disorder, which is partially why it's so hard to treat, really. But I would say, as you were asking, one of the maybe metaphoric, poetic, or real reasons that I instinctively feel with my mother was that her stuff was security. It was safety. She literally formed barricades around her with stuff. She was holding on to something. She was, uh, there was also, as I was saying before, this hyper awareness that she kept newspapers. And this is common with hoarding disorder. And I once asked her, why? Why do you need all the news? She would print out websites and keep stashes of the web. And she didn't want to miss anything. She didn't want to miss any information. Couldn't miss anything. There was such a need to cull and contain the information, to make sure everything was assessed, everything was seen. And these barricades, I really do think provided her with almost a security blanket, a literal sense of physical security. And in fact, I think that's why, when you see these reality television shows, hoarding disorder, which by the way is how most people know about hoarding disorder, it's through reality TV, it's through, people come in and they try to get rid of all the stuff. That's the worst thing, because the stuff is the security. It's not the problem. It's the solution for people who suffer from hoarding disorder to some people and to some degree. And so getting rid of that security is worse. That's what I felt with my mother.
While your relationship with your mother is a dominant storyline in your memoir, we will not ignore your father and your younger brother. How did they shape the person you became? Were they sources of strength, comfort, and healing for you?
Hmm. That's an unexpected and difficult question. Yes, of course. My families were very close, and I think that my father, Patu, is turning 90 in a few weeks, and I was just writing a toast in my head for him, and my father's been a very he's supplied me through my life with a lot of wisdom, a lot of nuggets of wisdom that really, let me tell you, when I was very young, I was a very shy and anxious child, and my father made me take judo lessons. And I wanted to do doll making. I wanted to do chess. I was very, very awkward. And he really forced me to take judo. I was the only girl in the class. And by the end of the class, I was flipping the huge boys over my back. And my father felt, you have to take judo because in judo, you learn how to fall. And that was very important for him, that I understood how to fall. Because if you can fall well, then you're going to be okay. And that's something I don't know, that stayed with me, still stays with me, and
It's
many
a, it's a,
nuggets like that.
it's a great metaphor. Paul Simon has a song, you've got to learn how to fall before you learn how to fly, right?
Yeah,
That's a
yeah.
great metaphor. So, when you were a young woman, you left Montreal and you went to pursue your education at Harvard, and then you eventually moved to London. So, when you look back, how much of that was you pursuing opportunities, and how much of it was a desire to create some distance from the world that you grew up in?
Oh, yes. It was both, but I was definitely running away. I really felt, I always felt out of place. I was just one of those people that never, always felt like an outsider, and always sort of was, for a long time, was on the run. But I think, I used to say my mother, my grandmother suffered from hoarding disorder, whereas I became a militant minimalist. My mantra was less is too much. I really tried to distance myself from what I felt was physical and metaphorical piles, weight, baggage, and I, uh, I really felt I needed to become there was no room for me to become myself among all the stuff. And I needed to find an open, white walled space where I could start to become myself.
Mm. Wow. In the dedication of White Walls, you have a quote from Maya Angelou. You can never go home again, but the truth is you can never leave home, so it's all right. I'm wondering what was it about that quote? It's wonderful, by the way. What is it that spoke to you?
I wrote my walls many years ago, so hearing that now, she's so brilliant. I don't know what I can say. Um, I think now when I hear that, I think about safety. Maybe we're always seeking, or I was always seeking some sort of imagined original place of ultimate safety, um, trying to find that. But I guess ultimately, whatever notion of safety that we have been brought up with sticks with us forever. Does that make sense?
Of course.
The
Of
thing we're
course.
always looking to go back to is it's created who we are.
I absolutely understand that. I can resonate with that. So, again, as we follow your life path, London was really more for you than just a new place to live. You really built a life there. You performed as a comic.
I used to be funny.
You could still be funny. We don't know. I mean, funny never really leaves us. But then, almost by accident, you came across a forgotten Yiddish book that completely changed the course of your life, and that became The Light of Days. Can you tell us that story, please? I'm sure it's remarkable.
Yeah, so I moved to London. I was busy running away from my family and my past. I used to say I became an art historian. I used to say curator was the least Yiddish word I knew, and I wanted into that. I was working in the British art world. It was very far away from the home I came from. I literally was working in a museum of living rooms. Um, so I was trying to create some kind of order through distance. Um, in my life in London, it was the first time in my life where I really found myself to be I later joked as the only Jew in the village. I I was really in a circle or in social circles with very few, if any, Jewish people. And that was the first time in my life, in my 20s, that I had that experience. And because of that, I started to see myself quite differently. It was really the first time, and it feels very obvious now, but it wasn't then. It was when I started to ask, where does this anxiety come from? As you asked me earlier, is my anxiety from my family history, which for the first time felt very unique? Does my Holocaust heritage shape how I perceive and react to everyday threats and dangers? This is what I wanted to explore. And I wanted, so as you said, I was doing stand up at the time. I was going to write a comedy show about this. I actually did a vague comedy show. I was looking at this idea of strong, what would it take? What would it mean to confront danger as a Jewish woman? How can I confront danger? Can I confront danger? Where's my anxiety? So I was exploring this idea, but I was also a historian, and so I wanted this piece to have a historical kind of backbone. And I was thinking, what are examples of strong Jewish women who had really confronted danger? I was looking for almost an answer. And the only person I could think of at the time was someone I had studied in fifth grade. Her name was Hannah Senish. And as I had studied, she was a Hungarian Jew who made Aliyah in the 1930s. She was a poet. She was a playwright, very artistic family. She moved to British Palestine. She lived on a kibbutz. But during World War II, Hannah Senish decided to fight back. She joined the Allied forces. She became a paratrooper. And she volunteered to return to Nazi-occupied Europe to fight the Nazis. She was actually killed very early on, but as I had studied in fifth grade, the legend was she looked her executioner in the eye as he shot her. I, I grew up with Hannah Senish as an example of Jewish courage. She was a hero figure. But back when I was writing this comedy piece, I didn't want to just understand Hannah Senish, the hero. I wanted to understand Hannah Senish, the person. I wanted to understand how a Jewish woman confronts danger. Who chooses to go fight the Nazis? What would make a poet decide to jump out of airplanes? I really was looking for a psychological or sociological analysis of Hannah Senesh. And I went to the British Library and I looked up Hannah Senesh in the catalog, and there are not very many books about her. So I just ordered everything. And when I got my stack of books, I immediately noticed one of the books was unusual. It was an old book in a blue fabric cover with gold embossed lettering on the front and yellowing pages. And it was in Yiddish. It was called, as I saw on the front, Frauen in die Ghettos, Women in the Ghettos. But I always say, as more unusual than the book is the fact I speak Yiddish. So I started flipping through this book looking for Hannah Senesh, and it's like a 200-page book or so. Hannah Senesh in the last 10 pages. In front of her, there's 190 pages of stories of other young Jewish women and teenage girls who fought the Nazis, and primarily from the ghettos in Poland. These were young Jewish women who were running underground soup kitchens and schools and secret libraries, all the way through to young Jewish women who shot Gestapo men in the head, who blew up Nazi supply trains, and who flung Molotov cocktails during ghetto uprisings. And I mean, I'd never read anything like this. And I always say this book hat mir gehabt, like the project caught me. I wasn't setting out to work on this. And here I am 19 years later and still basically researching and lecturing on this subject. And that book became the catalyst for my book, The Light of Days. Yes.
So you spent years living with those stories. Did those stories begin to change you? What did they teach you? Not only about courage during the Holocaust, but about what it would mean for you to be courageous in your own life.
Yeah. I mean, these stories taught me they taught me many things, but they taught me, first of all, that these women, first of all, you can be courageous in many ways. Some people can pick up a gun and shoot someone. I don't know that I could do that. But some people were editors or couriers or courageous in, spiritual or emotional ways, telling jokes. Some people were, they kept up spirits. They created camaraderie through humor. And sometimes you have to fight in a way that's right for you. But really, these women inspired me. I mean, these women risked their lives time and time again, fighting for justice and liberty and Jewish dignity. They would not be shamed. They would not be put down. They were proud of who they were, and they would never lose that. And I think that's very powerful. And, we talk a lot about how trauma trickles through generations. It's, inspired several books I've written and probably my day-to-day, but so does strength. Strength also travels through generations, and so does courage, and so does daring, and so does passion and compassion. And I think and I hope writing that book taught me that too. Yes, my family was very traumatized, but also very strong.
It's an amazing insight that we really cannot lose, that strength also moves across the generations. So we're going now to your newest novel, The Last Woman of Warsaw. And that novel goes back to Poland. It goes rather than memory or history, it follows the path of fiction. So after writing your own story and then recovering the story of these remarkable women who were warriors, what drew you to tell this story as a novel?
I'm hearing you ask me these questions. Look, I'm spending all those years running away, and here I am going back and back and back into what I was originally running away from. Yes, once again, I find myself in 1930s Warsaw. So as I was writing The Light of Days and researching it over many years, the questions I was asking, what kind of world created these young Jewish women who are so daring and bold and intelligent and literary? And if you look at photos, and I do a lot of photo research, very stylish. It didn't jive with my conception of what pre-war Warsaw was, even though my grandparents had lived there. I really imagined interwar Polish Jewry. I mean, in my mind, it was basically Anatevka. It was shtetl, it was bakwa, it was, I don't know, long skirts, religious. And Warsaw, I mean, decrepit, gray, decay. I always say it has war in its name. I always had very negative connotations. And as I started to study the period and really try to understand these women that I'd written about, I learned I was completely wrong. Polish Jewry, there were 3.3 million Jews in Poland. It was 10% of the country in the late 30s. Was a very diverse community, politically, class-wise, religious-wise, many secular Jews, many assimilated Jews, many religious Jews, but many who were not, wealthy Jews, very poor Jews, shtetl Jews, urban Jews, leftist Jews, right Jews, capitalist, communist, Zionist, Bundist, every combination thereof. And Warsaw itself was a cultural hub. Nightlife, theater, comedy. There were 180 Yiddish newspapers and magazines published in Warsaw in the 30s. Warsaw was a fashion. It was called the Paris of the North. And I found archives of fashion shows set in fancy hotels. There was a fashion cafe with a dedicated runway in the back. There was a Warsaw boating club that hosted fashion events. Warsaw was the capital of neons. We think Las Vegas is now the capital of neons. Warsaw was the original artistic capital of neon art. I didn't know any of that. And I felt really, really compelled to tell that story to, first of all, obviously we've spoken a lot about the death of Jews in Poland, and rightfully so. But I wanted to write for once about the life of Jews in Poland. Jews had lived in Poland continuously for over 1,000 years before the Holocaust. So I wanted to share that. I wanted to also mourn this lost world of Jewish imagination. I feel like we so destroyed. We don't even know so much that was created there. The theater, the comedy, the music. I wanted to almost say a Kaddish for that in a way. I also wanted to share that was a very sophisticated world. And I think we or I have a tendency to say, well, they were very primitive. We're very sophisticated, secular, modern, but they were no different. What happened to them can happen now and to our world. And as always, I wanted to inspire with strong Jewish women characters who work to figure out what they believe in and then fight for it with pride.
In White Walls, Judy, you described creating a life that was really almost the opposite of the one that you grew up in. It was one of minimalism, order, simplicity. Then you became the mother of three children, and life has a way of becoming a little bit more chaotic. How did motherhood change the way you understood your own mother, and perhaps even the way you understand yourself?
I mean, becoming a mother changes everything about my self-perception. Of course, I understand my mother so much more. And with every stage of my own children growing up, I can relate back and better understand the challenges that any parent and that my mother faced raising children. It's hard. I think that, I wrote one piece once about how when my kids were young, I actually had trouble getting rid of some of their stuff, the onesies and the clothes and the towels with the elephant hoods and the machines with the toys and the thing. And I almost freaked out. I mean, oh my gosh, am I also, is this a hoarding tendency? Is there something, am I like this too? And a little bit of me is. And I realized that some of the stuff I didn't want to get rid of because it was so beautiful. And it reminded me of these connections and these loving moments and these incredible moments of especially having young children and the excitement of that. And I wrote about how my mother, I always thought of her stuff as a barricade, but maybe it was also a bridge. a way of connecting us through love, and through, maybe you hang on to things that made you feel happy too, and try to surround yourself with that. And I understood that for the first time.
We call this podcast To Be Continued because every survivor's story continues through the generations. Talking about hanging on to stuff. When you think about your children, what would you like them to hang on to? And what chapter do you hope they're going to write next?
Ooh, that's a tough question. Um, I really want my kids to be proud Jews. I really hope that they feel very excited about their past and their identity and their community and their history, and study it, and are interested in it, and I don't know. I guess we'll see.
So let me ask you a question that haunts me and maybe it haunts you. What keeps you up at night? And then the flip side of that, what gives you hope?
Oi, what keeps me up at night? This could be a whole other podcast. Maybe I should do it. What keeps you up at night? Um,
Well, I'll tell in my case, it's drinking coffee after 9 p.m. That's you just don't go
9
there.
p.m. I'm like a 1 p.m., maybe noon.
Really?
Yeah.
Oh my God, you're a lightweight.
I'm a lightweight.
Yeah.
Um, I mean, I'm definitely concerned about anti-Semitism. It really weighs on me. It really does keep me up at night. I'm concerned about the world that my kids will have to grow up in and face. I have a lot of concerns about, I've actually been very concerned about this parasite that's in the produce. I have a lot of anxieties around health, and I think also related to my past too. And actually, that's been keeping me up at night the past few weeks. Um, is that enough? I'm sure there's more, but those are the latest.
You seem to be doing okay.
I mean, you have to go on.
We do.
Yeah, you have to go
And,
on.
and that really is the lesson. So, Judy, what gives you hope then?
I'm trying to think of a really good example. You know what gives me hope? Like random acts of kindness, or even not random acts of kindness. If someone does something nice that they don't have to do, seeing that, acknowledging that. I'm trying to think of a good example. And it can be something from, being an ally to the Jewish community that really is meaningful and gives me hope, to this morning I went for a dental procedure, and I really get panicky with dental procedures. And one of the hygienists working in the office, she was massaging my arm and really helping to calm me down. I felt so touched by that. She didn't have to do that. Look, I'm crying even. It was so moving to me that she went out of her way to comfort me and make me feel better for 5 minutes. That kind of human connection and desire to make someone else feel seen and safe and comfortable. It can come in the smallest ways, but that's what gives me hope. And someone gave that to me. I'm going to do that for someone else today or tomorrow.
Well, Judy, we want to thank you for being our guest. And if I can extend one of the large metaphors that we've been playing with during this conversation, we take those stories of kindness, of unremitting goodness, stories of unexpected saintliness, of seemingly small people who do large things, of people who engage in a kind of moral calisthenics. We take those stories and, if I may, we have to hoard them. We have to create our own pile
Mm-hmm.
of those stories to get us through the darkness. And there is much of it, but we are also hoarders of hope. This episode is a production of the 2G, 3G project, produced and edited by Ellie Hershko and co-directed by our podcast founder, Cheryl Hoffman. Once again, I'm your host, Rabbi Jeff Salkin. You can find To Be Continued on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, Audible, wherever you get your podcasts. And if you believe that these 2G and 3G voices are important, and we hope that you will, then we invite you to support us in several different ways. First, on your podcast app, hit the follow button. This way you won't miss an episode. And second, please, you're going to have friends and family who need to hear this material, who will find hope and resilience. So share those episodes with them and on your social media pages. And finally, can we please ask you, consider supporting what we do. We are fiscally sponsored by Jewish Creativity International, which is a 501c3 nonprofit. We rely on donors for their gracious generosity and their vision, and they help us keep producing our show. And you can contact us at info@tobecontinuedpodcast.org. That's one word, tobecontinuedpodcast.org, to donate. Until next month, thank you for your support, and thank you so much for listening.